I wanted to talk about the Ghostbusters reboot when it came out, but a lot of people were talking about it, and there was a lot of vitriol flying around, so I kind of thought I'd save it. Well, the dust has settled, and here I am. The reboot, which I'll refer to here as Ghostbusters 2016, is a failure, and I mean that in terms of box office. It took about $144 million to make, and, as of November, according to Box Office Mojo, it brought in around $229 million. But, with marketing and other costs, Sony needed it to make $300 million to break even, and about $500 million for it to be considered a success. So according to those figures, the movie lost about $70 million. That's a McDonald's cheeseburger for every single resident of Thailand. Now, Sony's spokespeople, when they're asked about this, as you might imagine, they always say something like, "Oh no, the figure is much lower. When you count in merchandise and the boost to the series, it's more like 50 million or 25 million. Well, it may be 25 million, but that's only because Village Roadshow had to take a big bite of that shit sandwich too, because they were co-financiers. I'm going to give you my reasons why I think the film bombed. But first, let me tell you where I'm coming from. I try not to review movies on this channel. I'm trying to move more in a direction of looking at things in film that work or don't work and talking about them. Directorial styles, the business of film, and the backstories behind films and famous film franchises. I dislike enough movies which everyone else likes and like movies that everyone else dislikes to know that me saying, I think it's crap, isn't really worth much. But what I would say is I like the original Ghostbusters a lot. I like the laid-back but pacey style. I like the witty humour. I like the effects. I think it's a very well-made film. I'm not a super fan, but I like it. As for Ghostbusters 2016, I don't hate it. I don't think it's a terrible film. It's a bit saggy, but it's not the worst film ever made, by far. When I heard about the reboot and watched the trailer, I didn't have a gut-wrenching reaction to it. I just rolled my eyes as I do with every reboot or dignity-defying sequel. I read a Forbes article looking for the movie's numbers, and incidentally, they got their numbers from Hollywood Insider and they got their numbers from Box Office Mojo. Anyway, Forbes said this: but the notion that the relatively traditional marketing campaign, along with instances of the cast, crew, or studio heads decrying the online trolling, was somehow disrespectful to Ghostbusters fans, is a form of cultural insanity. Now, I agree, the marketing was normal, and people involved in the film pushing back on online voices chatting shit wasn't disrespectful. It was necessary. I'll talk about the online stuff later. I want to hone in on that word, disrespectful. You see, I don't think Ghostbusters 2016 means any disrespect to the original film. I think it actually has quite a few respectful nods in there. But it is an inferior product, perhaps inevitably so. And a large part of that, I think, is due to it being in development hell for so long. This is my first explanation for why Ghostbusters 2016 tanked. And I don't care what Sony says about boosting the franchise. It tanked. Hollywood producers don't become Hollywood producers to make a film that breaks even, and Ghostbusters 2016 can only dream of that. Number 1. The franchise hadn't been properly developed in years. It was a movie the fans didn't want. It didn't play in China. Now, we all know there are franchises out there which can be quiet for years and come back to huge successes. Star Wars was remastered and introduced to a brand new generation. Terminator has been going on for more than 30 years. The thing is as much goodwill as Ghostbusters had and has behind it, and as successful as the first movie was, the franchise is nowhere near as big as the franchises of Star Wars or Terminator. Yeah, sure, the original made $295 million. That is impressive. There were video games, toys, cartoons, but there were only 2 movies, one in 1984 and a commercially less successful one in 1989. To continue the franchise organically, you'd need a sequel sometime in the 90s. Otherwise, a new movie wouldn't really be a straight sequel. If there were 15 years between Ghostbusters 2 and Ghostbusters 3, you have to say something about it. It's going to be obvious that Ghostbusters 3 isn't a direct continuation of Ghostbusters 2. You need to say something about why all the main characters are 15 years older. You can do that, you can adapt. But my point is 15 years didn't pass between Ghostbusters movies. 27 years did. Usually between movies it's a lot shorter. If you want to roll one out every 3, 4, 5 years, you can have video games and cartoons to keep up the hype. There were 12 years between Terminator 2 and Terminator 3, But Terminator 2 was a lot bigger than Ghostbusters, and it spawned a lot more identity streams. Although it should be noted that as well as the original movie's success, there was 2009's Ghostbusters the video game, which did very well, and showed that the franchise still had interest. But despite that continuing interest, I think that there had to be more than 2 Ghostbusters films in the first place to create a sufficiently large franchise. There's a reason it didn't come out in China. If it came out in 2004, yeah, maybe. But people who saw Ghostbusters the first time round, they're what, 40 now? Ghostbusters 1 and 2 didn't play in China anyway, but a 2009 release is much more accessible to a young Chinese audience than a 1989 release. Why am I prattling on about China? Because it is absolutely critical to the Hollywood big bucks movies. Terminator Genisys made more money in China than it did in the US. It still lost money overall, but it made $100 million in China. That's because Terminator is a much more established franchise in worldwide terms. In China, people don't know what Ghostbusters is. Reportedly, Bill Murray didn't want to do a third movie. He didn't particularly like the second, and he didn't like the scripts for the third. Reportedly, Dan Aykroyd, who wrote the original with Harold Ramis, sent Bill Murray a script after one of many announcements that the wheels on a second sequel were finally in motion, and Bill Murray sent it back to him, having shredded it. Bill Murray just didn't want to do it, and after Harold Ramis's death in 2014, I think most people probably just thought, there'll never be another one. But then there was another one, the reboot, a reboot that fans didn't want. You see, remakes or reboots, different versions of things, can work. As I've said before, Invasion of the Body Snatchers does it well. But apart from the heavy weight of the movie name, there usually isn't a good reason to remake or reboot. I think probably, if you could survey people who consider themselves real fans of the first 2 movies, they'd say a third movie should have had Harold Ramis in it and everyone else and been made at least 10 years ago, in an ideal world. Or failing that, it could have been made in 2016 with the surviving cast as Ghostbusters. Or failing that, Ghostbusters 3 shouldn't have been made. Quite simply, the established audience didn't want it, and the brand wasn't strong enough to pull in enough of a new audience. It's like if they started making new Columbos with someone doing an impression of Peter Falk. People who like the old Columbos aren't going to be impressed, and people who are 20 are going to say, "What's Columbo?" So why not just make something original, or at least give it an original name? This leads me to the second point. The cast was wrong, i.e. it wasn't Dan Aykroyd, Ernie Hudson, Bill Murray and Harold Ramis. It couldn't be, so it shouldn't have been made without them. Okay, so that's a little bit of a retread for sure, but I want to use that as a jumping off point. Ernie Hudson was born in 1945. With respect to Ernie Hudson, he is an old man. Dan Aykroyd and Bill Murray are slightly younger, but not much younger. Ghostbusters just wouldn't have worked with them. Perhaps a movie where they hand the ghostbusting reins over to a younger generation would have been more in line with fans' expectations. I don't know. I know one of Aykroyd's scripts did that. As it is in Ghostbusters 2016, they have cameos, but not as their previous characters. I think if you were going to have them as old guys, you either do the handoff thing or you've kind of got a Space Cowboys sort of thing going on. So that was the problem, right? Ramis was no longer around. The other guys were too old. A big budget addition to the franchise needed young blood, and the producers knew it. Incidentally, for smaller returns, I think you could have just thrown some pocket money at a documentary team and made a film called We Were Ghostbusters. Just interviews with the cast and crew of the original 2 Ghostbusters films about their production process. Throw $10 million at it for marketing. That would make a profit. Anyway, if you ask me, the production was in between a rock and a hard place. Fans wanted the original cast, but that wasn't going to work. Now this is where we perhaps inevitably come on the issue that surrounded Ghostbusters 2016. Before doing this video, I read a lot of reviews and discussion pieces where people talked about the decision to make the Ghostbusters women. I think in 100 years people will still be studying everything that was written as a way of looking at social prejudices and the division in society, because I couldn't find anything objective. On the one hand, you have a lot of established critics who start their review or mention in it somewhere something about online trolls. Of course women don't ruin the franchise. Misogyny, bigotry. Oh, and by the way, it isn't very good, but it's not because they're women. On the other hand, I read quite a lot about Ghostbusters 2016 being super feminist, being really left-wing, being partisan because they mentioned something about an anti-Irish fence. Now, in my opinion, this film isn't feminist, and I really wouldn't care if it was. In fact, if you really want to get into it, I don't think it challenges gender stereotypes or social norms at all. And I don't think that's a failing. I don't think it ever wanted to. In my opinion, and this is just conjecture because I have no evidence at all, I wasn't in the room, in an early script or production meeting, they had a discussion, as they always do, about who they would cast. Which big-ticket actors could they get? Who could do this? Could we give a cameo to so-and-so? Things like that. And someone floated the idea, hey, what if the Ghostbusters were all women? I think the closest this film gets to feminism is probably one of the producers saying to another producer, and if we make them all women, it will make us seem really progressive. It's a gimmick. It's like doing an all-black production of Hamlet. It really doesn't matter. It's the script that matters. Did they write or tweak the script for all women leads? Yes, undoubtedly a little bit. It's not gender neutral. But it's really not relevant. Would the script have been better if the leads were all men? Yeah, maybe. If you got different writers. The reason I bring this stuff up is because it's very unclear how this affected the box office. The reason a reboot exists, and there isn't a film with Kristen Wiig and Melissa McCarthy called Ghoul Exterminators, is because there's a boost with an established name. I may have said it doesn't have the clout of Star Wars or Terminator, but still, Ghostbusters is a big deal. An all-female team inspires interest, and also, it seems, a lot of hate. There are no statistics as to whether the online trolling helped or hindered Ghostbusters 2016, but if I was to guess, I'd say it didn't really affect things. James Rolfe, the angry video game nerd, made a video saying he wasn't going to go and see the movie, and that wasn't because there were female leads, that was because he saw it as cynical. I think others would have done the same, even if it was a cast of men, and I think counter to that, a lot of people who looked at the trailer and said, I hate it looks terrible, probably went to see it anyway out of sheer curiosity. Female leads drummed up media attention, but I'm not sure it inspired significant numbers to go. And all the naysaying before the movie came out, I'm not sure that really inspired significant numbers to stay at home either. A lot of both sides of all that stem from the trailer. A lot of people started writing about it after that came out. And this brings me to my last point. The film was tonally different from the first, so much so that it was incongruent. This isn't because they're women. Ivan Reitman directed Ghostbusters 1 and 2, and Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis wrote both of them as well. Paul Feig, as writer-director, and Katie Dippold, as co-writer, were always going to do things differently. I think it's also worth saying that Bill Murray has a very unique screen presence, one that none of the new cast come close to, and I think he was pretty important to Ghostbusters 1 and Ghostbusters 2 in making them what they are. His cameo in Ghostbusters 2016, and as I've said, not as his original character, is so brief, it's inconsequential. If they tried to make Ghostbusters 2016 a continuation in terms of tone and humour, they failed. And if they didn't try to do that, they made a strategic error. I think the lack of tonal congruity was pretty obvious in the trailer, and in all honesty, I think it was the trailer that was most damaging for this movie. In fairness, it wasn't dishonest. It starts with one of our protagonists being vomited on, and then saying that the goo got everywhere. It's dumb. Actually, looking back at it, it's pretty badly cut. The moment where they say let's go, the moment with the wig and the jump, they're actually nowhere near as cringeworthy in the film. In fact, I actually thought they were funny in the film, because they were part of understated scenes. You didn't have pumped up music in the background. I'm not sure what others thought, but I'd say the visual effects, whilst no doubt technically impressive, totally missed the beat. They look like something you'd shoot at from a ride at Universal Studios. The original puppets are a lot more grotesque and demonic.
Do exactly as I say. Get ready. Ready? Get her!
The new effects look nice, but they also look very Disney. They don't look like what we've seen before, and I don't think they're interesting enough to captivate a new audience. And that's where I conclude. I don't think any of Ghostbusters 2016 was unique enough to capture the attention of the casual cinema goer, and that's what it needed to do. Famously, Sony's president of worldwide distribution, Rory Brewer, said just after the film opened, he had no doubt a sequel would happen. If I was a Sony executive, sitting in my cavernous office, and someone crawled in, pleading for a sequel, I would have them hauled off to the dungeon before finishing my glass of blood. These have been my thoughts on why Ghostbusters 2016 failed. I may not be right at all. If you have any insight yourself, I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching. Please like this video and subscribe. Also, this isn't a comment on any of the films or anything like that. I just wanted to say that I really like the Ghostbusters logo, but to me it always seemed that the ghost who was being busted was raiding someone's fridge and they just surprised him. Like if they hadn't surprised him, if they weren't going to bust him, in 5 seconds he'd have someone's cold sausage roll in his mouth. I'm just saying.